I'm also doing my PhD in conjunction with the Melbourne Football Club, so if I'm looking a little bit melancholy today, there's a very good reason for that. But our research there is sort of looking at predictive modelling of injuries using training loads and various other variables. But as James said, I'm actually not going to talk about my research too much today. I'm going to share some research from a couple of other individuals. And so normally I like to make acknowledgements at the end of a presentation, but I'd like to start off by introducing you to a couple of the people whose work I'm going to present to you today. And so there's the hamstring injury crew over at ACU, just down the road, headed by Dr. David Opar and Dr. Ryan Timmins, who we may be familiar with. And there's also Tony Shield and Matt Bourne up in Queensland, as well as Morgan Williams over in Wales, and they've all contributed highly to the research I'm going to present to you. All right, so hamstring strain injury is the most common injury in our sport, and incidence rates at the elite level anyway really haven't declined in recent times. And there's been a lot of research which has attempted to identify factors that increase or decrease the risk of injury. And two of the more commonly and consistently identified factors are increasing age and a history of hamstring injury. But these are typically what we consider to be non-modifiable. So there's not much we can do to directly impact those particular risk factors. And so I'll come back to them shortly. But we tend to focus on the more modifiable risk factors, or factors that we can target and change through intervention to ultimately reduce the risk of injury. And amongst these we have eccentric hamstring strength, biceps femoris long head fascicle lengths, and training loads as well. Now obviously I'm being a little bit selective about the risk factors I'm talking about today. There's many factors that impact the risk of hamstring injury, but these are some of the more commonly researched ones. And so, as James said, my research is sort of looking at training loads. I could give another presentation entirely on training loads, but I'm going to touch on it very briefly today and how it relates specifically to hamstring injury. And so I know we have internal workloads, so RPE-derived training loads and metrics like that, but I'm going to focus on external workloads, and we typically associate external workloads with GPS data, yeah? I understand that some of you guys might not have access to GPS data on a regular basis, but the points I'm going to illustrate are still highly applicable and relevant to you guys. And so when we think about hamstring injury, high-speed running is the most common mechanism of injury, but high-speed running volumes have also been associated with the risk of injury as well. So this data set here is actually from my honours work, and it's a couple of years old now. I don't want to say it's outdated, it's still current and relevant, but just keep in mind when it comes to training loads and hamstring injury risk, there's more questions than answers, and we still have a lot of work to do in this space. But this particular data set was collected across one AFL season from about 220 participants. So on the y-axis, we've got weekly distance covered above 24 kilometres per hour. Just think of this as weekly high-speed running distance. And on the x-axis, we've got the percentile ranking. So we basically ranked those weeks from the lowest amount of high-speed running to the highest amount of high-speed running. And we ran some different statistics and actually found an optimal statistical cut point to be 653 metres. Now this actual value might not hold too much relevance outside of this particular data set, but what it allows us to do is make comparisons between what we can consider low volumes and high volumes. And so if we have a look at the injuries that occurred, illustrated by the white points, it's actually pretty hard to see on this graph. It's probably not the best for illustrating this particular point, but the rate of injury when weeks exceeded that cut point was actually 3.4 times higher than the weeks below that cut point. So what that tells us is that acute high-speed running volumes, absolute volumes, are important when it comes to injury risk. But interestingly, when we actually expanded that window and looked at 3 and 4 weekly distances, the risk associated with the volumes in those windows actually dissipated. So it seems to be, particularly with hamstring strain injury, it might be different for other pathologies, but the risk associated with high-speed running volumes is rather transient. So there seems to be a critical time window of 7 to 14 days. And so we looked at some relative metrics as well, and hopefully we're all familiar with the acute to chronic workload ratio and perhaps the work of Tim Gabbett. He's done some awesome work in this space. This particular figure was actually built using RPE-derived training loads, but it applies to external workloads as well. And so he suggests in this particular paper that when the acute to chronic workload ratio exceeds 1.5, that this is actually predictive of injury. And so we thought that's really cool. We're going to try it with high-speed running. And so this is basically the same graph that we saw before, but it's acute to chronic workload ratio using high-speed running data. Again, on the x-axis, we've got our percentile ranking. When we applied that cut point at 1.5, here we can see that the majority of the injuries actually occurred below that cut point. Okay, so in terms of the acute to chronic workload ratio, we really need to be cognizant of what it's there for. If you think about it, it's not meant to predict injury at all. It's just a reflection of good or bad progressive overload. Okay, so we shouldn't be using it to predict injury. It's just there as a guide. All right, so that's not to say relative high-speed running volumes aren't important. Again, there's just more work to be done in this space. And so just to summarize a couple of those points, absolute volumes are important. Relative volumes may still be important, but just be aware of the limitations of things like the acute to chronic workload ratio and what we should really be using it for. It seems to be a critical time window of 7 to 14 days when it comes to hamstring injury risk associated with high-speed running volumes. So it's rather transient. Could be very different for other pathologies, but hamstring injuries seem to be a rather acute injury. We also need to consider the protective effect of high-speed running. So there's been a paper published recently by a crew over on the West Coast, which tried to infer a protective effect of high-speed running, but really the data wasn't too strong, so their findings were null, essentially. But we likely know practically that there is a protective effect of high-speed running, and that's an important consideration when prescribing training loads. So we're going to move on from training loads and high-speed running and chat more about some of the more commonly researched risk factors, which are eccentric hamstring strength and biceps femoris long head fascicle lengths. And so this data here is from the work of Ryan Timmons, his PhD, and basically I should preface this by saying this data set was actually collected in an elite soccer cohort, so in the A-League. But the points illustrated by this data are still highly applicable to us working in AFL. But on the y-axis, we've got fascicle length. And whenever I talk about fascicle length, I'm referring to biceps femoris long head fascicle length. Okay, and it's actually estimated using two-dimensional ultrasound. And that particular skill set is Ryan's specialty, and it's one that he developed over the course of his PhD. And obviously, when I talk about eccentric hamstring strength, I'm referring to Nordic force measured via the Nord board, which hopefully we're all familiar with. But if you have a look at the data, we can see some horizontal and vertical lines here. Again, they're statistically derived cut points. The actual values of those cut points might not hold too much relevance outside of this data set, outside of this cohort, but what it allows us to do is make comparisons between short and long in terms of fascicle length, and weak and strong in terms of Nordic force. And if we have a look, we've got 4 quadrants, and this bottom left-hand quadrant has been nicknamed the Quadrant of Doom, and for very good reason. Out of the athletes that resided in this quadrant, 39% of them went on to sustain a prospective hamstring injury. As opposed to our long and strong athletes in the top right quadrant, only 4% of them sustained an injury. And so this gives us a nice comprehensive summary of the interrelationship between fascicle length, Nordic force, and injury risk as well. And so just to delve into that a little bit deeper, before I mentioned previous hamstring injury being non-modifiable, of course it's non-modifiable, but on this graph on the y-axis we've got probability of HSI or hamstring injury. And that's basically estimated from some logistic regression models. On the x-axis we've got our fascicle length. And if we have a look here, we can see that the white point is an athlete with previous injury. So in athletes that possess short fascicles, having a previous injury makes a big difference in terms of their risk of future injury. So there's a big difference there. But when we increase fascicle length, we can actually offset the risk imposed by having that previous injury until it's almost negligible compared to previously uninjured athletes. So whilst it's non-modifiable, we can actually modify the risk imposed by that injury by targeting the more modifiable factors. And so this figure's a little bit harder to interpret, but we're looking at age now, and we can see those older athletes compared to the younger athletes. When they possess short fascicles, their risk is increased. But when we increase fascicle length, age isn't as big of a factor in terms of hamstring injury risk. And I don't have the data to show today, but the same relationship exists with eccentric hamstring strength as well. So we can offset the risk imposed by those non-modifiable factors by increasing eccentric hamstring strength. And so that sort of led Ryan to ask a couple of different questions over the course of his PhD. One was, can we increase eccentric hamstring strength? The other was, can we increase biceps femoris long head fascicle lengths? And we probably know a little bit more about increasing eccentric hamstring strength. We might not know as much about fascicle length adaptations. So I'm going to focus primarily on that today. But in order to answer this question, we conducted a very big training intervention study in which we had two groups that completed 6 weeks of isokinetic dynamometry training. And we had an eccentric training group, so they did eccentric leg curls only. And we had a concentric training group, which did concentric leg curls only. You can have a look here. Again, on the y-axis, we've got change in fascicle length, and on the x-axis, the intervention time point. So at the end of the intervention, the eccentric training group saw a significant increase in fascicle length. But interestingly, the concentric training group actually saw a decrease. And again, we found this rather interesting. Following 4 weeks of detraining, the eccentric training group actually returned to baseline. So with the removal of that eccentric stimulus, all adaptations were lost. As opposed to the concentric training group, they actually stayed at those shorter fascicle lengths. Important to keep in mind that this training was done on a dynamometer, so the external validity of this is questionable. Can't imagine you guys would have too many athletes that would be lining up to jump on one of them to do their training. And so Matthew Bourne, over the course of his PhD, wanted to investigate what conventional resistance training exercises actually specifically target the hamstrings. And so he found in an early study that knee-dominant exercises actually preferentially recruit the medial hamstring, so our semitendinosus and our semimembranosus, whereas the hip-dominant exercises actually selectively target the lateral hamstrings or biceps femoris long head. And out of those knee-dominant exercises, no surprises, the Nordic hamstring curl targeted the medial hamstrings the most, or to the greatest extent. Out of the hip-dominant exercises, it was the 45-degree hip extension on the Roman chair, which targeted biceps femoris long head the most. But out of all the exercises that he looked at, the Nordic hamstring curl had the highest level of medial and lateral activation. And so what he wanted to do is take those two exercises. We knew that they targeted the hamstrings in terms of activation, but he wanted to investigate the impact of an intervention utilising those exercises on architectural adaptation, so fascicle length. And so here we've got our 3 groups, so our hip extension group, our Nordic hamstring exercise group, and our control group. You can have a look. Over the course of this intervention, the control group did nothing and nothing happened. It's what we expect, but we can see that the hip extension and Nordic hamstring exercise group saw significant increases in fascicle length with those interventions. But interestingly, a criticism of the Nordic is that it has small muscle excursion ranges, but despite this, it actually saw greater fascicle length adaptations than the hip extension, which had much larger or much greater muscle excursions. The mechanism behind this, we're not too sure, but in terms of architectural adaptation, training with the Nordic hamstring exercise saw far greater increases in fascicle length. And so at this point, we know that the Nordic hamstring exercise increases fascicle length. We also know it increases eccentric hamstring strength. I haven't touched on that too much up to this point. But what we also know is that training interventions utilising the Nordic hamstring exercise actually result in hamstring injury rates being decreased by up to 60%. And there's been a number of intervention trials which have actually demonstrated this. The biggest was by Peterson et al. But on top of that, a survey, I should say, conducted by Roald Barr actually found that 83% of elite European soccer teams didn't implement this protocol at all, despite there being strong evidence to suggest that it reduces injury rates. And there were a couple of different reasons for that, but the number one reason, it was suggested that the training volumes of this particular intervention were way too high to implement in an elite environment. And so Joel Preslin, over the course of his honours, he wanted to investigate whether a low volume training program could actually result in the same adaptations that we knew higher training volumes were capable of. And so important thing to note here on this slide is that the volume for the two groups was actually exactly the same during the first 2 weeks of training. But following this, the low volume training group actually went on to do 312 repetitions less than the high volume training group over those 6 weeks. So again, same figure that we've seen before. On the y-axis, we've got change in fascicle length. On the x-axis, we've got our intervention time point. So we can see that both the high volume and low volume training groups saw significant increases in fascicle length. But the really important thing to note is that there was absolutely no difference in terms of the magnitude of these adaptations between those two groups. So low volume was as effective as high volume in driving those adaptations and maintaining them as well. But again, interestingly, with the removal of that eccentric stimulus, all adaptations were lost in as little as 2 weeks. Yes?
Can I just ask a quick question on what the athlete cohort was for that study?
That was recreational athletes. So again, the external validity of this and how you would apply it in an elite environment, that's something that we want to look at. But these guys were all recreationally active. So no, they were not doing the same training volumes that you would expect in an elite cohort. But again, looking at fascicle length adaptations in those kind of cohorts is something that we're looking at. Really important point to note, we think that the low volume or the adaptations that we saw with those lower training volumes were really the cause or the result of each repetition being supramaximal. So every repetition performed by both groups was supramaximal. And we ensured it was supramaximal by progressively loading the participants. And so Christopher Pollard has since done some work in this space where he compared bodyweight Nordics to externally loaded Nordics and found that externally loaded Nordics resulted in far greater adaptations in terms of fascicle length and strength than those bodyweight Nordics. So ensuring that each repetition we do is supramaximal is really important. Keep that in mind. Intensity is the key to driving positive adaptation. All right, so at this point, hopefully we're not suffering too much information overload. Apologies to those of you who I've put to sleep. Yes?
Sorry to jump in, and it's just going back to where you talked about before comparing between your Nordics and your 45 degrees
Yep.
extension. Did you have that same kind of focus on trying to maintain the relative intensity between the two different exercises?
Yeah, exactly the same. So in that particular exercise, both the hip extension and the Nordic hamstring exercise were progressively loaded to make sure that it was supramaximal. Obviously with the hip extension, it wasn't supramaximal because they did both the eccentric and concentric phase. With the Nordic hamstring exercise, we only performed the eccentric phase. So that's a lot easier to make supramaximal. So just to summarise, give you a nice concise summary of some of the points that I've made up to this point of the presentation. Eccentric contraction of the knee flexors, we know that increases fascicle length. However, concentric contraction, this actually decreases fascicle length. We know that knee dominant exercises preferentially recruit the medial hamstrings whereas those hip dominant exercises, they selectively target biceps femoris long head. Out of the knee dominant exercises, Nordic hamstring exercise saw the highest level of medial activation. For the hip dominant exercise, 45-degree hip extension, saw the highest levels of lateral activation. We know that both these exercises result in increased fascicle lengths, but in terms of activation, absolute activation and architectural adaptation, the Nordic hamstring exercise was superior to the 45-degree hip extension. We know that low volume Nordic training, or the program that you saw previously, is as effective as high volume Nordic hamstring exercise training in terms of driving positive adaptations and maintaining them as well. And we know that as little as 2 sets of 4 reps per week are enough to maintain fascicle length adaptations. But we can get away with these lower volumes, however, intensity is the key. So each repetition that was performed was supramaximal. We also know that if we remove that eccentric stimulus, that adaptations can be lost in as little as 2 weeks. And so what does that all mean in terms of hamstring injury prevention? So when we're designing a program, this is evidence-based, but also what's practically applicable as well. We should be looking at having one knee dominant exercise. We should also have one hip dominant exercise. Now our knee dominant exercise, this should be eccentric only. Okay, and we know that concentric contraction of the knee flexor shortens fascicles, so we want to avoid that. So your hammy curls, avoid them, okay? In terms of hamstring injury prevention, might have benefits in other facets of our program, okay? But if we're trying to prevent hamstring injuries, hammy curls is not the way to go, okay? You want to do an eccentric only knee dominant exercise. And I've got the Nordic there as an example. If you have a suitable alternative, that's fine. But keep in mind the Nordic is probably the easiest exercise to apply and to make sure that it is eccentric only. It also has the most evidence supporting it. In terms of our hip dominant exercise, this can be conventional. Okay, so you can do both the concentric and eccentric phase. I've got hip extension there as an example because that's what I've spoken about. But your RDL or unilateral RDL, that's perfect. Okay, that would be my choice in terms of prescribing a hip dominant exercise for hamstring injury prevention. So again, we get away with low volumes, but intensity is the key. All right, is there any questions on that? Because I'm going to move away from prevention and talk more about rehabilitation now. So just before I do, any specific questions? Yes?
That's good. This one. We do the RDLs. We also do a version of the Nordics like a razor curl.
Yes.
The eccentric, they can't actually hold it long enough.
Yep, absolutely, yep.
But then does that come down to a shortening the fascia because you're saying because it's a bit more concentric or?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. I haven't presented the data today, but an honours student in our group actually compared the razor hamstring curl to the Nordic hamstring exercise. And in terms of strength and fascicle length adaptations, the razor hamstring curl did nothing at all. So it didn't increase fascicle length, didn't shorten fascicles, but it didn't increase them. Also didn't result in increased eccentric hamstring strength. But keep in mind, eccentric hamstring strength was measured during a Nordic, so on the Nord board. But if you think about the razor hamstring curl, because we have hip extension and knee extension, it's more of an isometric exercise. So we're probably actually not exposing the hamstrings to that eccentrically induced muscle damage during a razor hamstring curl. Again, it might have benefits in other elements of the program, but when it comes to hamstring injury prevention, yeah, again, there's probably more research to be done on it, but at this point in time, it doesn't seem to be beneficial.
So we're better off sticking with the Nordic and then just a limited eccentric range of motion.
Absolutely. So, like we were saying before, anything is better than nothing. So the idea is to get them to be able to control the movement all the way to the bottom. Once they can do that, what you actually need to do is externally load them to make sure that it is supramaximal. But if they're going halfway and failing to control it the rest of the range, that's telling you that it is supramaximal and that they are working purely eccentrically, which is an important thing. So I'd just get them starting off at body weight, really try and focus on getting them to the end of range. But if they're only getting halfway through range, that's fantastic. As long as that's super maximal contraction and they're giving it everything they've got, you're going to see beneficial adaptation from that. All right, so I'm going to chat about rehab now. Following acute hamstring injuries, we can sometimes see persistent inhibition, and following this, we can also see persistent or ongoing deficits in eccentric hamstring strength and fascicle length as well, which we know increase the risk of injury, first-time injury, and potentially re-injury as well. And so that's why good rehabilitation is really important. And I just want to preface this part of the presentation by saying there are many facets and many elements to a good rehab program. I'm going to focus purely on the strength training progression. Okay, so don't think that I'm ignoring progressive running and things like that. Okay, I'm focusing just on the strength training aspect. But when we think about conventionally reported guidelines, this might not be what you're doing, but it's what's commonly reported in the literature. Following an acute hamstring injury, it's suggested that we start off by introducing isometrics at varying lengths. Okay, once our athlete can perform those isometrics at a submaximal intensity, pain-free, we can then progress and introduce conventional exercises at moderate lengths. Once they can do those isometric contractions maximally, pain-free, and their injured limb is within 90% of their uninjured limb in terms of strength, we can then progress and introduce conventional exercises at long lengths, as well as those eccentrically biased exercises as well. But when we think about, following that, once we've ticked all the relevant boxes, we can then clear that athlete for return to play. But if we think about the constraints of rehab, we often have a lot of pressure from coaches and administration staff to return an athlete to play as quickly as possible. But what we also want to do is make sure that we reduce the risk of this happening. Okay, so rehab becomes about reducing re-injury risk as quickly as possible. And so keeping that in mind, if we follow those conventional guidelines and we're under time pressure from coaches and from administration, might actually lead to minimal exposure to those eccentrically biased exercises. And we know that those eccentrically biased exercises are responsible for driving positive adaptation in terms of strength and fascicle length. So minimal exposure to them might actually be why we see these persistent and ongoing deficits following an acute injury. So Jack Hickey, he's done a monumental PhD. That work's coming out now, so you'll hopefully see it soon. Some of you might already be familiar with some of it. Again, he conducted a very big randomised control trial in which he implemented a very sort of in-depth rehabilitation protocol. There were many elements to that. Again, I'm just focusing on the strength training aspect of that. But he proposed some alternative guidelines. So rather than these conventional or commonly reported guidelines, he suggested that we actually remove this progression based on isometric exercises and introduce all these elements from day one, at the very start of rehab. And rather than progress these exercises based on their isometric contractions, this is just to give you an example of some of the exercises that we utilised, rather than progress these exercises based on the isometric contractions, actually progress the exercise based on the exercise. So he progressed these exercises to unilateral variations with the completion of the rep range and full range of motion as well. And also when he progressed that first exercise, which is actually a bilateral sliding leg curl in the top right there, when he progressed that to a unilateral variation, also introduced the Nordic at this point in time as well. And what I want to focus on now is those eccentrically biased exercises, because that's where we know we get our positive adaptations from. So this graph here, on the y-axis, we've got the percentage of participants that successfully completed all of these eccentrically biased exercises. And we've also got on the x-axis days from acute hamstring injury. And so when we implemented that exercise-specific progression, those alternative guidelines, the athletes successfully completed all of these eccentrically biased exercises, including the Nordic, within a median time of 5 days following injury. However, And I say successfully completed. They did it and there were no complaints at all. But if we were to follow those conventional guidelines and wait until they were pain-free on isometric contractions, this wouldn't have happened until 11 days post-injury. And even more, if we were to wait until they were pain-free and their injured limb was 90% of their uninjured limb, would have taken even longer. And when we consider that the average return to play time in this particular cohort, which was a mixture of elite and sub-elite athletes, there was about 45 of them, average return to play time was 16 days following injury. Following those conventional guidelines doesn't actually allow for much time to get those eccentrically biased exercises in and potentially drive those positive adaptations. And so we've seen this graph before. On the y-axis we've got injured limb fascicle length. On the x-axis we've got injured limb eccentric strength. I've got our 4 quadrants again. We can see that when the athletes were introduced to the eccentrically biased exercise, before they did them, this is where they were at in terms of their fascicle length and Nordic force. So the majority of them were in that quadrant of doom. But come return to play, which was on average 16 days following injury, we can see that the majority of them actually shifted to that long and strong quadrant. So just to summarise a couple of those points, keeping in mind the constraints of rehab, by following and implementing that exercise-specific progression, what we can actually do is allow early exposure to eccentric loading. This can potentially drive those positive strength and architectural adaptations, which will hopefully reduce our risk of injury. So we might not actually be shortening that return to play window, but what we're doing is allowing our athlete to get more work done over the course of rehab, which will hopefully reduce their re-injury risks to a greater extent. And so that's all I have in terms of a prevention and rehabilitation perspective. If anybody wants to get in touch with any questions, feel free. Otherwise, open to questions now.